You're not seeing him again, do you hear me? He's trouble, and you're my daughter.
You don't know him. You don't even try, Dad.
I know enough. He's not setting foot in this house.
Then I won't either. I'm going to marry him and go with him.
Don't you...
Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the case file, the manila folder worn soft from years of handling. 6 years since she'd closed it for the last time. 6 years since she'd walked away from the FBI with her badge in one hand and her resignation letter in the other. The ghost of Thomas Patterson had followed her from Quantico to this quiet California suburb, and now his daughter sat in the same interrogation room where Margaret had once destroyed an innocent man's life. The Mill Valley Police Department occupied a modest building on Throckmorton Avenue, all glass and California modern architecture that couldn't hide the familiar institutional smell of burnt coffee and disinfectant. Margaret had hoped never to step foot in another police station, but Detective Ray Hoffman had specifically requested her consultation. The irony wasn't lost on her. The behavioral analyst who'd lost her ability to read people called in to analyze the most disturbing case she'd encountered since leaving the bureau. "You sure about the identification?" Hoffman asked, sliding a current photograph across the metal table. Sarah Patterson, now calling herself Emma Hendricks, stared back with the same calculating eyes Margaret remembered from crime scene photos. The girl had been 14 when her family was murdered, 17 when her father jumped from the Potomac Bridge. Now 23, she'd perfected the art of looking vulnerable while orchestrating violence. "Facial recognition confirms it," Margaret said, though she didn't need technology to recognize those features. She'd studied every photograph in the Patterson case file, memorized every witness statement, analyzed every piece of evidence until the details burned themselves into her brain. Sarah Patterson disappeared from foster care when she turned 18. Social services assumed she'd aged out of the system normally. Instead, she reinvented herself and found a new family to terrorize. Hoffman's weathered face showed the strain of a 20-year career in law enforcement. The question is, why Robert Hendricks? What's the connection? Margaret opened her laptop and pulled up the doorbell footage again. Even knowing Sarah's true identity, the performance was masterful. The way she'd positioned herself in the camera's optimal viewing angle, the timing of Robert's stumble, just intoxicated enough to seem unstable, not so drunk he couldn't follow choreography. Sarah's reaction to the staged strangulation, shock and fear perfectly calibrated for maximum impact. "She's been planning this for months, maybe longer," Margaret said, watching Sarah's micro-expressions frame by frame. "Look at her hands. She never tries to remove his grip from her throat. Natural survival instinct would be to claw at his fingers, try to break his hold. Instead, she keeps her arms at her sides, making sure the camera captures his hands around her neck. Professional opinion? This was premeditated. This was theater." Margaret paused the video at the moment Robert's hands made contact. Sarah Patterson learned early that adults will believe almost anything if a child appears to be in danger. She's been refining that skill for 9 years. The case file seemed to pulse with malevolent energy on the table between them. Margaret had read every page so many times she could recite witness statements verbatim. The Patterson family murders, mother, father, and 8-year-old son found shot execution style in their Virginia home. 14-year-old Sarah discovered hiding in a bedroom closet, traumatized and mute. Margaret's profile had pointed toward Thomas Patterson. Financial stress, recent job loss, family annihilator psychology. The investigation had focused exclusively on him until he couldn't bear the scrutiny anymore. The real killer had never been found. Margaret suspected she was sitting in a holding cell 20 feet away. "Robert Hendricks," she said, pulling up his background check on her tablet. "Investment advisor, divorced, lives alone in a $4 million house, no children of his own, meets a troubled young woman who needs a father figure, gradually becomes emotionally invested in her welfare. Classic predator grooming pattern, except in reverse." Sarah becomes the predator. She studies his routines, his vulnerabilities, his relationship with alcohol. She probably encouraged his drinking, maybe even provided the bourbon that night. Then she waits for the perfect moment to destroy him, just like she's probably destroyed others we don't know about yet. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. Mrs. Henderson canceled her 3 p.m. camera installation. Saw the news about Robert Hendricks. Doesn't want someone who missed the warning signs protecting her family. The reputation she'd spent 6 years carefully rebuilding was already cracking. Word traveled fast in Mill Valley, especially when it involved one of the community's security consultants missing signs of domestic violence in her own client. Margaret had installed the Hendricks doorbell camera system 3 months ago. She'd spent 2 hours in Robert's home, assessing sight lines and vulnerability points. If she'd missed something, if there had been signs, but there hadn't been signs because Robert Hendricks wasn't a predator. He was a victim, just like Thomas Patterson had been, just like Margaret herself had become, trapped in Sarah's expanding web of manipulation. The question was whether she could prove it before Sarah disappeared again, leaving another destroyed life in her wake. Margaret's house sat at the end of Cascade Drive like a fortress disguised as suburban normalcy. The irony wasn't lost on her, a security consultant who'd turned her own home into an impenetrable bunker. Motion sensors tracked her approach up the flagstone walkway. Cameras monitored every angle of the property. Reinforced locks secured doors that had never needed reinforcing in a neighborhood where the most serious crime was usually package theft. She'd bought the Craftsman bungalow 6 years ago with the last of her FBI pension, drawn to its position at the base of Mount Tamalpais, where the hills created natural barriers on 3 sides. The previous owners had called it peaceful. Margaret called it defensible. The key turned with a satisfying metallic click. Mechanical locks, not electronic. Technology could be hacked, manipulated, overridden. Physical barriers required physical presence to breach. Every security measure reflected the paranoia that had driven her from Quantico to this California refuge. But today, they felt inadequate. Sarah Patterson had already breached her defenses simply by existing in her territory. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and lemon oil, scents her cleaning service used that never quite masked the underlying staleness of a home where windows stayed locked and curtains remained drawn. Margaret dropped her keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, a gift from her sister Janet, painted with cheerful sunflowers that seemed to mock the fortress mentality surrounding them. The living room held only essential furniture, a leather chair positioned with clear sightlines to all entrances, a glass coffee table that couldn't conceal threats, built-in bookshelves displaying her criminology texts like trophies from a war she'd lost. No family photographs adorned the mantelpiece. Those lived in a single drawer upstairs, too painful for daily viewing, but too precious to discard. Margaret poured herself 2 fingers of Macallan, better bourbon than whatever Robert Hendricks had been drinking when Sarah orchestrated his downfall. The irony burned almost as much as the whiskey. She'd spent decades analyzing how alcohol lowered inhibitions and compromised judgment. Yet here she stood, seeking the same chemical comfort that had made Robert vulnerable. Her reflection caught in the kitchen window, 58 years old, silver hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn at the bureau, dark circles under eyes that had seen too much. The nervous breakdown had aged her in ways that 6 years of suburban quiet couldn't repair. She looked like exactly what she was, a broken investigator hiding in plain sight. The Patterson case file lay open on her kitchen table where she'd been reviewing it that morning, as if her subconscious had known Sarah would resurface today. Crime scene photographs spread across the walnut surface like tarot cards predicting disaster. Margaret had studied these images thousands of times, searching for the clue that would have changed everything, the clue that would have saved Thomas Patterson's life and her own sanity. The 8-year-old boy's bedroom always hurt the most to examine. Michael Patterson, found face down beside his race car bed, still clutching a plastic dinosaur. Margaret had profiled his father as the killer based on financial stress and family dynamics, never considering that the traumatized sister might be capable of such methodical violence. 14 seemed too young for that level of calculation, but Margaret knew better now. Evil didn't follow developmental timelines. Her phone rang, shattering the kitchen's oppressive quiet. Janet's number flashed on the screen, her older sister's weekly check-in, timed with California precision for East Coast dinner hours. "You sound tired," Janet said without preamble, that maternal tone she'd perfected during Margaret's darkest period. "Are you eating actual meals, or surviving on coffee and stubbornness again?" Margaret smiled despite herself. Janet lived 3,000 miles away in their childhood home in Vermont, but somehow maintained surveillance that would impress the FBI. "I had a complicated day at work. The security business that stressful? I thought you just installed cameras for paranoid rich people. If only it were that simple." Margaret's security consultation had become her lifeline to normal human interaction. Wealthy Mill Valley families who paid her to ease their anxieties without realizing she shared every one of their fears. They trusted her expertise, while remaining safely unaware of why she'd developed it. "One of my clients was arrested today," Margaret said, choosing words carefully. Janet knew about the breakdown but not its specific triggers. "Domestic violence case. Makes me question whether I missed warning signs." "Oh, honey." Janet's voice carried 6 years of accumulated worry. "You can't save everyone. You learned that the hard way." The hard way. Such gentle phrasing for professional destruction and psychological collapse. Margaret appreciated Janet's protective euphemisms, but they couldn't soften the truth. She'd failed before, catastrophically, and now Sarah Patterson had positioned her to fail again. Outside, Mill Valley settled into its evening rhythm of safety and affluence. Streetlights illuminated empty sidewalks where children could walk without fear. But Margaret knew safety was an illusion, and Sarah Patterson had already begun dismantling it one calculated move at a time. The doorbell camera in her own foyer blinked its steady red recording light, capturing nothing but shadows and Margaret's mounting dread. Margaret ended the call and set her phone aside, but the familiar comfort of Janet's voice couldn't settle the restlessness clawing at her chest. She moved through her evening routine on autopilot, checking door locks, reviewing security feeds, drawing curtains against the Mill Valley darkness. But tonight, the ritual felt hollow, insufficient protection against a threat that had already infiltrated her carefully constructed sanctuary. The Patterson case file beckoned from the kitchen table like a wound that refused to heal. She'd promised herself 6 years ago never to open it again, yet there it lay, crime scene photographs scattered across the walnut surface like evidence of her professional failure. Margaret reached for the folder to close it, to restore some semblance of order to her disrupted evening, when her fingers brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. An envelope. Cream-colored paper, expensive weight, her name written across the front in careful script. It hadn't been there this morning when she'd spread the case materials across the table. She was certain of that. Her obsessive attention to detail was both blessing and curse, cataloging every element of her environment with forensic precision. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the envelope. No postmark, no return address. Just her name in handwriting that seemed vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen it before. The paper felt warm against her fingers, as if it had been recently handled. Inside, a single sheet of stationery bore a message that stopped her breathing. "M.S. Chen, you always were thorough in your investigations. I remember reading about your methods in the newspaper articles after Daddy jumped. Such attention to detail, such careful analysis of family dynamics. You really believed you understood us, didn't you? I've been watching your new life in Mill Valley, the quiet house, the security business, the way you've convinced yourself that helping rich people feel safe makes up for what you did to my family. It doesn't." Today was just the beginning. Robert Hendricks was practice, a test to see if you'd recognize my work. You did eventually. I'm impressed. But recognizing the pattern won't help you stop what comes next. You destroyed my father with your profile. You took away the only person who ever protected me, who ever saw past what I had to become to survive. Now I'm going to destroy everything you've built here, one carefully planned performance at a time. Mill Valley's families trust you to keep them safe. Let's see how long that trust lasts when they realize what you really are. A broken analyst who can't tell predator from prey. Give my regards to the Hendricks family. S. The letter fluttered from Margaret's nerveless fingers, landing among the crime scene photographs like a missing piece of evidence finally come to light. Sarah Patterson had been inside her house, had walked through rooms Margaret had fortified against exactly this kind of violation, had placed this letter on the table while Margaret sat in the police station, analyzing doorbell footage and building profiles that Sarah had already anticipated. Every security measure had been meaningless. Every lock, every camera, every motion sensor, useless against someone who understood that the most effective attacks came from within the victim's own assumptions about safety. Sarah hadn't needed to break down barriers. She'd simply walked through them as if they didn't exist. Margaret's legs gave way, and she collapsed into the kitchen chair, her fortress of control crumbling around her. The careful distance she'd maintained from her past, the suburban anonymity she'd cultivated, the professional reputation she'd rebuilt grain by grain, all of it had been an illusion. Sarah had been watching, planning, preparing to strip away every defense Margaret had constructed. The implications hit like physical blows. If Sarah could enter her home undetected, she could access Margaret's client files. The security systems Margaret had designed for Mill Valley's most prominent families, the schedules, the vulnerability assessments, the detailed layouts of houses where children slept safely behind locks Margaret had personally installed. She wasn't the only potential victim anymore. Sarah had weaponized Margaret's own expertise, turned her security knowledge into a roadmap for targeting the families who trusted her most. The Hendricks case hadn't been about Robert at all. It had been about demonstrating that Margaret's professional judgment was fatally compromised, that the security consultant Mill Valley's elite families depended on couldn't even protect herself. Margaret reached for her phone to call Detective Hoffman, then stopped. What could she report? That someone had entered her home and left a threatening letter? There would be questions about her connection to the writer, investigations into her past, revelations about the Patterson case that would destroy what remained of her credibility. Sarah had planned for that too, had anticipated every move Margaret might make. The letter wasn't just a threat, it was a trap, forcing Margaret to choose between protecting herself and protecting her clients. Either way, Sarah won. Outside, Mill Valley streetlights continued their cheerful illumination of empty sidewalks. But Margaret now understood that the safety she'd helped create here was about to become the stage for Sarah Patterson's next performance. And this time, Margaret wouldn't be analyzing the aftermath. She'd be living it. The doorbell camera's red light blinked steadily in the foyer, recording nothing but shadows that suddenly seemed full of watching eyes. Margaret stared at the letter until the words blurred together, her rational mind desperately searching for explanations that didn't exist. A prank, a coincidence, someone who'd researched her background and was playing an elaborate joke. But the cream paper felt real between her trembling fingers, and the handwriting carried an intimacy that no stranger could fake. She forced herself to stand, to walk through her house with purposeful steps, checking every room for signs of entry. Nothing disturbed. No windows jimmied, no scratches around the door frames, no footprints on the hardwood floors her cleaning service had polished yesterday. The security system showed no breaches, no gaps in its digital vigilance. Yet Sarah had been here, had moved through these protected spaces like smoke through a screen door. The rational response would be to call the police, report the break-in, the threatening letter, the clear connection to an ongoing case. But Margaret knew how that conversation would unfold, Detective Hoffman asking pointed questions about her relationship to the letter writer, digging into the past Margaret had buried beneath 6 years of suburban respectability. The Patterson case would surface, along with every brutal detail of her professional collapse. Her client base would evaporate overnight. Instead, she found herself reaching for her laptop, fingers moving across the keys with muscle memory from countless late-night case reviews. If Sarah wanted to play psychological chess, Margaret would at least understand the board. The Mill Valley Community Forum loaded slowly, its cheerful header proclaiming where neighbors become family. Margaret scrolled through recent posts, searching for any mention of the Hendricks arrest. She found it buried in a thread about neighborhood safety. Did anyone else hear about what happened on Elm Street? I always thought Robert seemed off. Too friendly, you know? My daughter used to babysit in that neighborhood. Makes you wonder who else we're letting into our community. Thank God for doorbell cameras. Who knows what would have happened if there hadn't been evidence? I'm canceling my security consultation appointment. If the so-called expert couldn't spot warning signs in her own client, what's she missing in the rest of our houses? Margaret's chest tightened. The reputation she'd painstakingly built was already unraveling, exactly as Sarah had predicted. Word traveled through Mill Valley's social networks faster than wildfire, and the narrative was crystallizing. The security consultant had failed to protect a vulnerable girl from a predatory client. Never mind that Margaret had never positioned herself as a behavioral analyst here, had deliberately marketed her services as purely technical. The community needed someone to blame, and she was the obvious target. Her phone buzzed. A text from another client. Hi Margaret, we've decided to postpone our camera installation. Family emergency. We'll call to reschedule, then another change of plans for tomorrow's appointment. Something came up. The pattern was clear. Mill Valley's elite were distancing themselves with the polite vagueness that money bought. No direct confrontation, no messy explanations, just the gradual withdrawal of trust that would strangle her business with suburban efficiency. Margaret closed the laptop and walked to her kitchen window, peering through a gap in the curtains at the quiet street beyond. The Hendersons' house sat dark except for porch lights, their doorbell camera a barely visible dot above the entrance. She'd installed that system herself 3 months ago, had spent an afternoon explaining optimal positioning to Mrs. Henderson while her twin boys played in the yard. Now Mrs. Henderson was probably researching new security companies, wondering if the cameras Margaret had recommended were worthless, if the woman who'd assured her family's safety was fundamentally incompetent. The truth clawed at Margaret's throat. She wanted to call each client, explain that Robert Hendricks was innocent, that they were all being manipulated by someone far more dangerous than any suburban domestic abuser. But Sarah had weaponized Margaret's own credibility crisis. Any attempt to defend herself would sound like desperate deflection from a professional whose judgment had already proven faulty. She poured another whiskey, her third since arriving home. The irony wasn't lost on her, self-medicating with the same substance that had made Robert Hendricks vulnerable. But the alcohol dulled the sharp edges of panic, made the impossible situation feel merely catastrophic. Outside, a car engine purred to life somewhere in the darkness. Margaret stiffened, pressing closer to the window, but the sound faded toward the main road without revealing its source. Every noise now carried potential threat. Every shadow might conceal watching eyes. Sarah had transformed Margaret's sanctuary into a fishbowl, exposed and monitored from unseen angles. The kitchen clock read 9:47 p.m. In Virginia, it would be nearly 1 a.m., too late to call Detective Morrison, the investigator who'd handled the original Patterson case. Not that he would welcome hearing from the analyst whose profile had derailed his investigation and driven an innocent man to suicide. Some bridges, once burned, stayed burned. Margaret returned to the table where Sarah's letter lay among the crime scene photographs, like a bridge between past and present failures. The careful handwriting seemed to pulse with malevolent satisfaction, each word chosen to maximize psychological impact. Tomorrow she would lose more clients. The isolation would deepen. And somewhere in Mill Valley's manicured landscape, Sarah Patterson would be planning her next performance. The whiskey glass trembled against Margaret's lips as she forced herself to consider what she'd been avoiding all evening, the need to make contact with someone who could verify her worst fears. Detective Morrison in Virginia had every right to hang up on her, but he was also the only person who might remember details about Sarah Patterson that the official case files had sanitized. Margaret pulled up his contact information, a number she'd memorized during those final desperate weeks when the Patterson case was disintegrating around her. The call connected after 4 rings, Morrison's gravelly voice thick with sleep and immediately suspicious. "Chen? Jesus Christ, do you have any idea what time it is? I'm sorry, I know it's late, but..." "Late? It's past 1 in the morning. I told you 6 years ago I never wanted to hear from you again. Nothing's changed." Margaret closed her eyes, steeling herself against the familiar hostility. Morrison had been Thomas Patterson's champion from the beginning, the detective who'd believed in the man's innocence even when Margaret's profile painted him as a textbook family annihilator. "It's about Sarah Patterson. I think she's..." "Sarah Patterson is none of your goddamn business anymore. That girl went through hell because of your incompetence. Lost her father, her brother, everything. If she's managed to build some kind of life after what you put her through, the last thing she needs is..." "She's here, Morrison. In California. She's been manipulating crime scenes, staging domestic violence cases that mirror the original." The silence stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if he'd hung up. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that hadn't been there moments before. "What are you talking about?" Margaret explained the Hendricks situation in clinical terms, keeping her analysis focused on behavioral patterns rather than the personal vendetta Sarah had declared. Morrison listened without interruption, but she could hear something shifting in his breathing as the details accumulated. "You're certain it was staged?" he asked finally. "The positioning was too perfect, the timing too convenient. And tonight I found a letter in my house, Morrison. She'd been inside my home while I was at the police station." Another pause, longer this time. "What did the letter say?" Margaret read it verbatim, her voice catching on phrases that sounded even more threatening spoken aloud. When she finished, Morrison's response came as a whisper. "Fuck, you believe me?" "I didn't want to. God knows I've blamed you for enough over the years." Morrison's admission carried the weight of professional regret, but there were always things about that case that didn't fit. Sarah's statements about finding her brother's body, they were too detailed, too precise for a traumatized kid, and the timeline never quite worked. She claimed she was in her room doing homework when it happened, but the blood spatter suggested someone had stood, exactly where she would have been positioned. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "Why didn't you say anything?" Why didn't you investigate? Because she was 14 and had just lost her entire family. Because your profile made so much goddamn sense that I convinced myself I was seeing patterns that weren't there. And because... Morrison's voice trailed off. Because what? Because 2 days before Thomas Patterson killed himself, he called me. Said he was scared of his daughter, that she'd been threatening him. I thought it was desperation talking, a guilty man trying to deflect blame onto his victim. I didn't document the call, didn't follow up. I let him die thinking nobody believed him. The confession hit Margaret like a physical blow. Morrison had been carrying his own burden of responsibility all these years, his own what-if scenario that replayed in sleepless hours. Sarah hadn't just manipulated the evidence. She'd manipulated them all, turning their professional instincts against themselves. She's not finished, Margaret said quietly. The Hendricks case was just the beginning. She has access to my client files now, knows the security systems I've installed. Mill Valley's wealthiest families are all potential targets. Then you need to contact the FBI. Get them involved before... With what evidence? A threatening letter and a theory about a 6-year-old case? They'll run the same background check you would, find out about my breakdown, dismiss everything I'm saying as paranoid delusion. Morrison was quiet for so long Margaret thought the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice carried a determination that hadn't been there before. I'm coming to California. Morrison, you can't just... The hell I can't. I should have protected Thomas Patterson 6 years ago. Maybe I can't undo that failure, but I can make sure his daughter doesn't destroy anyone else. His voice hardened with resolve. Email me everything you have on this Hendricks case. Every detail, every inconsistency. If Sarah Patterson wants to finish what she started, she's going to have to go through both of us. The line went dead, leaving Margaret alone with the crushing realization that her worst fears were about to be confirmed by the one person who understood exactly how dangerous Sarah Patterson had always been. Margaret sat in the pre-dawn darkness, Morrison's words echoing in the silence he'd left behind. The crushing weight of 6 years' worth of misplaced guilt began shifting, revealing something far more terrifying underneath. The possibility that she hadn't been wrong about everything that night in Virginia. Her laptop hummed to life as she pulled up the archived files she'd promised Morrison. But her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. These were documents she'd avoided for years, case materials that had triggered panic attacks whenever she'd accidentally glimpsed them in her old filing system. Now she forced herself to open each folder methodically, building the email that would bring her former colleague across the country to confront a truth they'd both been too broken to see. The Patterson case photos loaded slowly, crime scene images that had once seemed to tell such a clear story. Thomas Patterson's body in the garage, the apparent suicide note, the positioning that had suggested overwhelming guilt. But now, armed with Morrison's revelation about Sarah's phone threats, Margaret found herself seeing details her traumatized mind had missed. The suicide note's handwriting looked forced, unnatural. Not the fluid script of a man making a final confession, but the careful forgery of someone mimicking familiar letter forms. The garage door had been closed when Sarah discovered the body, yet the carbon monoxide levels suggested the engine had been running for hours. How had a 14-year-old girl managed to move an unconscious adult male into position without leaving forensic evidence? Margaret's breath caught as she enlarged one photograph. Sarah in the police station, giving her statement with dry eyes and perfect composure. At the time, Margaret had interpreted the girl's calm demeanor as shock, trauma-induced dissociation. But the expression wasn't blank with grief. It was calculating, satisfied, the face of someone watching their carefully orchestrated plan unfold exactly as intended. Jesus Christ, Margaret whispered, echoing Morrison's earlier profanity. She killed them all. The brother found dead in his bedroom, supposedly the victim of Thomas Patterson's family-annihilating rage. The mother whose body had been discovered in the kitchen, positioned to suggest she'd been fleeing toward the back door when attacked. Margaret had built her entire profile around the assumption that Thomas Patterson was a methodical killer who'd murdered his family before taking his own life in the garage. But what if the killer had been someone else entirely? Someone small enough to move undetected through the house, smart enough to manipulate crime scenes, and ruthless enough to sacrifice her entire family for reasons Margaret couldn't begin to comprehend. The timeline Morrison had questioned suddenly made perfect sense with Sarah as the perpetrator. The girl could have killed her mother and brother, staged their bodies to suggest a domestic violence scenario, then confronted her father with the threat Morrison had mentioned. When Thomas Patterson refused to confess to crimes he hadn't committed, Sarah had simply added him to her victim count. Margaret's phone buzzed with an incoming message, startling her from the photographs. A text from an unknown number. Still working late, Margaret? You always were too dedicated to your cases. The phone clattered to the floor as Margaret jerked backward, her chair scraping against the kitchen tiles. Sarah had her number, was monitoring her activities closely enough to know she was awake at 4:17 a.m., reviewing case files in her kitchen. Another message appeared before Margaret could process the first. Detective Morrison seems eager to see California. I hope you told him how much Mill Valley has changed since he investigated me. How much I've changed? Margaret's hand shook as she retrieved the phone. The casual tone, the intimate knowledge of her conversation with Morrison. Sarah wasn't just watching anymore. She was actively engaged, playing a game Margaret was only beginning to understand. A third message arrived. You were right about me, you know. That night in Virginia when you told them to look closer at the family dynamics, when you said the killer was someone with intimate knowledge of the victim's routines, your instincts were perfect. It's such a shame nobody listened. The revelation hit Margaret like ice water. Sarah wasn't just taunting her, she was confirming what the crime scene photos had started to suggest. Margaret's original profile had been correct. She had identified the real killer's characteristics with devastating accuracy. But the investigation had been so focused on Thomas Patterson as the obvious suspect that they'd ignored the possibility of the surviving daughter being responsible. Margaret's breakdown hadn't been caused by professional incompetence. It had been caused by watching an innocent man die for crimes committed by the very person everyone was trying to protect. Her phone rang, Morrison's number appearing on the screen. She answered before the second ring. She's been texting me, Margaret said, without preamble. I figured she might be. Listen to me carefully, Chen. I've been going through my old notes, and there's something else you need to know. Morrison's voice was grim. Sarah Patterson didn't just disappear after the case closed. She's been building a new identity, complete with fabricated credentials and references. The girl doesn't exist anymore. She's become someone else entirely. Who? That's what I'm flying out there to find out. The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at her phone in the kitchen's pale light. Morrison's revelation settled over her like a weighted blanket. Sarah Patterson had spent 6 years becoming someone else, someone with access to Mill Valley's most vulnerable families. The scope of the deception made Margaret's throat constrict. How long had Sarah been planning this reunion? How many identities had she constructed, discarded, refined before finding the perfect one to infiltrate Margaret's new life? Margaret forced herself back to the laptop, fingers trembling as she typed Morrison's email address. The case files felt different now, not evidence of her failure, but proof of a truth that had been buried under collective guilt and institutional blindness. She attached photograph after photograph, each image a piece of Sarah's 6-year-old masterpiece of manipulation. But as she worked, another realization crept through her consciousness like poison. If Sarah had rebuilt herself completely, adopting new credentials and references sophisticated enough to fool background checks, then she wasn't operating alone. Someone had helped her construct this new identity. Someone with resources, connections, and a vested interest in Sarah's success. The doorbell camera in Margaret's entryway chimed softly, motion detected. Margaret froze, her cursor hovering over the send button. At 4:30 a.m., nothing should be moving on her front porch except maybe a raccoon or early morning jogger. She pulled up the camera feed on her phone, expecting to see empty concrete bathed in porch light. Instead, she found a small gift box sitting precisely centered on her welcome mat. Margaret's breath came in shallow gasps as she studied the image. The box hadn't been there when she'd arrived home hours earlier. She was certain of that, which meant Sarah had visited again, moving through Margaret's supposedly secure neighborhood like a ghost, leaving presence with the casual confidence of someone who owned the darkness. The rational part of Margaret's mind screamed warnings, don't go outside, call the police, wait for Morrison. But the behavioral analyst in her, the part that had spent 20 years reading crime scenes and understanding predatory behavior, recognized the psychological trap being constructed. Sarah wanted her to feel helpless, wanted her to cower inside while packages accumulated on her doorstep like offerings to some malevolent god. Margaret saved the email draft and walked to her front door, disabling the alarm system with fingers that barely cooperated. The October air bit at her skin as she stepped onto the porch, hyper-aware of every shadow that could conceal watching eyes. The box was light, almost empty, wrapped in expensive paper that caught the streetlight like silk. Back inside with the locks re-engaged, Margaret set the package on her kitchen counter and stared at it as if it might explode. The wrapping was perfect, professionally done, the kind of presentation that expensive boutiques use for their most exclusive clients. Sarah's attention to detail remained flawless, even in her psychological warfare. Margaret tore off the paper with movements that felt disconnected from her conscious mind. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, lay a single photograph, one she'd never seen before. The image showed Thomas Patterson with his arm around a younger Sarah, both of them smiling at some family gathering, a birthday party, judging by the cake and decorations visible in the background. Sarah couldn't have been more than 12, still wearing the innocent expression that had fooled everyone 6 years later. But Margaret's trained eye caught what others had missed. Even then, something predatory lurked behind Sarah's smile. The way she positioned herself in the photo, the calculated angle of her head, the possession in how she gripped her father's arm. This wasn't a daughter's affection. This was ownership. A note was tucked beneath the photograph, written in the same careful handwriting Margaret had learned to fear. He loved me more than the others. That's why he had to be the one to take the blame. Love makes people so wonderfully vulnerable, don't you think? Margaret's hands shook as the full horror crystallized. Sarah hadn't killed her family in rage or desperation. She'd done it because she could, because she'd recognized early that her father's love gave her power over him. The murders had been an experiment in control, a teenage psychopath's thesis project on manipulation and guilt. And now Sarah was conducting a follow-up study, using Margaret as her primary subject. The email notification chimed as Morrison's response arrived. Plane lands at SFO at 2 p.m. Don't do anything until I get there. Don't trust anyone you haven't known for years. And Chen, whatever Sarah's planning, she's had 6 years to perfect it. We're walking into her territory now. Margaret deleted the message immediately, paranoia making her second-guess every digital footprint she left. If Sarah could monitor her movements, track her communications, then nowhere was truly safe. The house she'd chosen for its security features had become a display case, every room visible to eyes she couldn't locate. Outside, Mill Valley continued its peaceful slumber, unaware that a predator moved among them with credentials they would never question, and a smile that opened every door. Margaret poured another whiskey and settled in to wait for dawn, Morrison's words echoing in her mind. We're walking into her territory now. The only question was whether they would walk back out. Dawn broke over Mill Valley with deceptive serenity, golden light filtering through Margaret's kitchen windows, as if this were just another peaceful morning in suburbia. But the whiskey glass in her trembling hands and the photograph of Sarah Patterson spread across her counter told a different story, one that would end today, one way or another. Margaret's phone buzzed with Morrison's final text before boarding, landing in 3 hours. Stay put. But Margaret was done following orders, done being reactive. 6 years of self-doubt and professional exile had ended the moment Sarah confirmed the truth. Margaret's instincts had been right all along. Thomas Patterson had died because Margaret failed to fight for her own analysis, because she'd let institutional pressure override her trained intuition. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Margaret pulled up the Hendricks' address in her client files, studying the security system she'd installed just weeks ago. Every camera angle, every sensor placement, she knew their vulnerabilities because she designed them. If Sarah was using the family as bait, Margaret would turn the trap back on its creator. The drive through Mill Valley felt like a funeral procession, each familiar street corner a potential last memory. Margaret's hands were steady on the wheel now, the shaking replaced by the cold focus she'd once brought to FBI crime scenes. This was what she'd been trained for, confronting monsters, even when they wore the faces of damaged children. The Hendricks house sat pristine in the morning light, its manicured lawn and perfect facade hiding the psychological warfare being conducted within its walls. Margaret parked across the street, watching for movement behind the windows. Her phone showed multiple missed calls from Robert Hendricks. Desperation, confusion, a man slowly realizing his daughter had become something he couldn't protect or control. Margaret's doorbell app chimed with motion at her own home. The camera feed showed Morrison's sedan pulling into her driveway 3 hours early. Impossible. His flight hadn't even landed yet. Ice flooded Margaret's veins as she zoomed in on the vehicle. The license plate was different. The driver who emerged wasn't Morrison at all, but someone wearing Morrison's jacket, moving with his confident stride. Even from the grainy camera feed, Margaret could see the performance was perfect, except for the smile. Sarah had studied Morrison as thoroughly as she'd studied Margaret, creating another flawless impersonation designed to draw Margaret back into isolation. The real Morrison was probably still airborne, unaware that his arrival had been anticipated and neutralized. Margaret's phone rang, her own home number calling her. She answered with hands that had found their steadiness again. "Hello, Margaret?" Sarah's voice was warm, conversational, completely at ease. "I hope you don't mind me using Detective Morrison's credentials to access your house." His identification was surprisingly easy to replicate. "Where is he?" "Safe. For now. He's having car trouble on Highway 101. Such unfortunate timing. But don't worry, I'm sure someone will help him eventually." Sarah's laugh carried genuine amusement. "You're at the Hendricks house, aren't you? I can see you from their security system, still trying to be the hero." Margaret looked up at the cameras she'd installed, realizing how completely Sarah had turned her own expertise against her. "What do you want?" "The same thing I've always wanted. For someone to finally understand what I'm capable of." Sarah's voice shifted, becoming younger, more vulnerable. "You were the only one who saw me clearly that night in Virginia. Everyone else saw a traumatized victim, but you saw the truth. Do you remember what you told them about the killer's profile?" Margaret closed her eyes, forcing herself back to that conference room 6 years ago. Someone with intimate knowledge of the family. Someone who understood their routines, their vulnerabilities. Someone they trusted completely. Someone invisible, Sarah added softly. Someone nobody would ever suspect because she was too young, too innocent, too broken to be capable of such precision. "You killed them because you could." "I killed them because I needed to know if I could. Do you understand the difference?" Sarah's voice carried an academic curiosity that chilled Margaret more than any threat. "Most people live their entire lives wondering about their capabilities, their limits. I've never had to wonder." Margaret started the car, no longer content to wait for backup that might never arrive. The Hendricks family, what have you done to them? "They're fine. Confused, but fine. Robert thinks his daughter is having a breakdown. Jessica thinks her father is losing his mind. Neither of them understands. They're part of a much larger experiment." Sarah's voice hardened. "An experiment that ends when you walk through their front door." The line went dead, leaving Margaret alone with the weight of inevitability. Sarah had orchestrated every move, anticipated every response, turned Margaret's own security systems into instruments of surveillance and control. But there was something Sarah hadn't counted on. Margaret was no longer the broken woman who'd fled Virginia in shame and terror. She was the behavioral analyst who'd correctly identified a killer when everyone else was blind to the truth. Margaret drove toward the Hendricks house, toward whatever ending Sarah had written for them both, carrying with her the quiet certainty that some confrontations were worth the risk of everything. The Hendricks' front door stood open, an invitation into darkness that Margaret accepted without hesitation. The house felt hollow, abandoned despite the cars in the driveway and lights burning in every window. Margaret's footsteps echoed on marble floors as she moved through rooms that bore no signs of struggle, no evidence of the psychological siege Sarah had described. She found them in the living room, Robert slumped in his leather chair, Jessica curled on the sofa with her knees drawn up like a child. Both stared at the doorway where Margaret appeared, their faces carrying the glazed confusion of people who'd been gaslighted beyond recognition. "She's upstairs," Robert said quietly, "waiting for you." Margaret nodded, understanding that this final act belonged to her and Sarah alone. The stairs creaked under her weight as she climbed toward whatever resolution Sarah had orchestrated, each step carrying her further from the broken woman who'd fled Virginia and closer to the analyst she'd once been. Sarah waited in Jessica's bedroom, sitting cross-legged on the pink comforter like any normal teenager. But the smile she offered Margaret was ancient, predatory, the expression of someone who'd learned to wear human faces without understanding their meaning. "You came," Sarah said with genuine pleasure. "I wasn't entirely certain you would. You killed 3 people to get my attention." Margaret remained in the doorway, studying the girl who'd destroyed so many lives with such casual precision. "What did you think would happen?" "I thought you'd understand." Sarah's voice carried disappointment, the tone of a teacher whose favorite student had failed a crucial test. "You're the only person who ever saw me clearly. I wanted to show you how much I've grown." Margaret stepped into the room, closing the distance between them. Up close, Sarah looked exactly like what she was, 18 years old, beautiful, radiating the confident energy of someone who'd never faced real consequences. But Margaret's trained eye caught the tells, the calculating measurement in Sarah's gaze, the way she positioned herself for optimal escape routes, the complete absence of fear. "You haven't grown," Margaret said. "You've just gotten better at hiding." Sarah's smile faltered for the first time. "I've become everything you said I was. Invisible, trusted, capable of precision that—" "You've become a cliché." Margaret's interruption carried the weight of 20 years' experience profiling killers. A textbook psychopath who thinks manipulation makes her special. "I've seen dozens like you, Sarah. The only difference is that most of them get caught before they turn 18. The mask slipped completely then, revealing the rage that had always simmered beneath Sarah's careful performance. She stood with fluid grace, her hand moving toward something concealed behind the pillow. A knife, Margaret realized, probably taken from the Hendricks kitchen. But Margaret was already moving, muscle memory from FBI training overriding fear. She caught Sarah's wrist as the blade emerged, using the girl's momentum to drive her face first into the bedroom wall. The knife clattered across hardwood as Sarah struggled with surprising strength, her careful composure replaced by animal desperation. "You don't understand," Sarah gasped against the wallpaper. "I needed you to see. I see a child who killed her family because she was bored." Margaret's voice remained steady as she secured Sarah's arms behind her back with zip ties from her security kit. "I see someone who spent 6 years planning revenge against a woman who was trying to save her father's life." Sarah went limp in Margaret's grip, the fight leaving her as completely as it had appeared. When she spoke again, her voice carried the hollow quality of someone whose last gambit had failed. "He really did love me more than the others," she whispered. "That should have been enough to save him." Margaret called 911 with hands that barely trembled, reporting the situation in the clinical terminology that felt like putting on old clothes. As sirens approached through Mill Valley's quiet streets, she sat in the bedroom chair and watched Sarah Patterson, the girl who'd haunted 6 years of nightmares, reduced to what she'd always been, a broken teenager whose pathology had been mistaken for trauma. Morrison arrived with the second wave of police, his face carrying equal measures of relief and professional satisfaction. "Plane got delayed," he explained. "Car trouble on 101, just like she said. Kid planned everything except getting caught." Margaret nodded, watching as paramedics checked Sarah for injuries before the formal arrest process began. The girl who'd orchestrated such elaborate psychological warfare looked smaller now, diminished by handcuffs and the reality of consequences she'd never truly believed would come. The Hendricks family would recover, Margaret knew. Therapy, time, and the knowledge that their ordeal was over would gradually restore what Sarah had damaged. Margaret herself felt something similar beginning, not healing exactly, but a quiet settling of accounts that had been overdue for 6 years. As they loaded Sarah into the police car, Margaret caught her reflection in the Hendricks hallway mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the broken analyst who'd fled Virginia in shame. She was someone harder, more cautious, but fundamentally sound. Someone who'd finally learned the difference between professional failure and surviving a monster's attention. Outside, Mill Valley returned to its peaceful suburban rhythm, unaware that the predator among them had been caged at last.